When I moved to that small rural town, I thought I was doing the best thing for me and my son, Kaio. We needed a fresh start after everything we had been through, and that place seemed peaceful. Wide streets, spaced out houses, and endless fields of crops stretching beyond the horizon. The rent was cheap, the neighbors were friendly, and Kaio was happy, spending his days exploring the yard and riding his new bike. I worked part-time at a local grocery store and spent the rest of my time with him. But then, on that cursed afternoon, everything fell apart. Kaio went out for a bike ride near the cornfield, something he had done several times before, and never came back. At first, I thought he had just lost track of time, but when night fell and he was still missing, panic set in. I called the police as soon as I realized something was wrong, but they didn't seem as worried as I was. They told me that boys his age sometimes ran away, hid, or simply got distracted and wandered too far. But Kaio wasn't like that. He never stayed out without telling me where he was going, and deep down, I knew something much worse had happened. I spent the entire night calling for him, screaming through the neighborhood, knocking on doors, asking everyone if they had seen him. Nothing. The next day, I went to the cornfield with a group of locals to search for him. That's where I found his bike, abandoned among the towering stalks of corn. The spokes of the wheel were bent, crushed, like someone had stomped on them with force. My heart pounded in my chest. He hadn't run away. Something happened to him there. I grabbed the bike with trembling hands, my mind racing. The police officers who came with us barely reacted. They glanced at it, muttered something about wear and tear, and continued their search like it meant nothing. But I knew this wasn't normal. I ran my fingers over the twisted spokes, feeling the sharp bends, the unnatural angles. Someone or something had done this. Kaio wouldn't have just left his bike like this. I tried to call out for him again, my voice breaking, but all I got in return was the eerie rustling of the corn swaying in the wind. It felt too quiet, unnaturally quiet. Even the others, the locals who had volunteered to help, started shifting uncomfortably. It was like the cornfield was swallowing up every sound, like it was listening. The search went on for days, but nothing turned up. The police officially classified him as a runaway, despite my protests. Sometimes kids just get tired of their lives and leave, one of the officers said, like Kaio had just casually walked away from everything he knew. I screamed at them, begged them to take it seriously, but I could see it in their eyes. They had already given up. To them, this was just another case of a missing child, another statistic, but I couldn't let it go. I started searching alone, going into the cornfield every night with a flashlight, calling his name until my voice was raw. Every time I had the same feeling like I was being watched, like something was there, just out of sight, hidden among the stalks. Then, on the fourth night, something happened that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I was standing at the edge of the cornfield, flashlight in hand, calling out for Kaio. I had just about given up when I heard it, just a faint rustling sound, like someone moving through the corn. I froze, my heart hammered in my chest, and I held my breath. The sound stopped. Then, a few moments later, I heard it again, closer this time. I swung the flashlight toward the noise, but I saw nothing, just the endless rows of tall corn swaying in the breeze. For a moment, I thought I was imagining it. I called out once more, but all I heard was the wind whispering through the plants. It was unsettling, like the field itself was trying to silence me. But then, as I turned to leave, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but when I looked again, my blood ran cold. There, lying in the dirt between the corn, was a small folded-up piece of clothing. It was Kaio's shirt, the one he had been wearing the day he disappeared. My stomach twisted with dread, and I rushed over to it. It was clean, perfectly folded, as if someone had carefully placed it there. It made no sense. He hadn't come back home. No one had seen him. So how could this shirt be here, neatly folded, like it had been washed and set aside? I felt dizzy, like I was standing in some sort of nightmare, and the only thing keeping me from losing my mind was the desperate hope that it was some sort of sign. But deep down, I knew this was not a sign of hope. It was a sign of something far worse. I stood there, gripping the fabric of Kaio's shirt so tightly my knuckles turned white. My mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. Who had placed it there? Why was it clean? My first instinct was to run back to the house, call the police again, demand that they reopen the investigation. But I knew how that would go. They would dismiss it as coincidence, or worse, accuse me of planting it there myself. I needed proof. I needed something more. So instead of running, I turned back to the field, my flashlight shaking in my hands, and took a step forward. The moment my foot hit the dirt, the rustling started again, but this time it wasn't just the wind. It was deliberate. Slow, rhythmic movements, coming from deeper within the rows of corn. It was as if something or someone was waiting for me to come closer. I swallowed hard, every instinct in my body screaming at me to leave, but I had to know. I stepped in further, pushing through the stalks, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The deeper I went, the stronger the feeling of being watched became. I turned in every direction, flashing my light between the plants, but I saw nothing. And then, just as I was about to turn back, I heard something that made my stomach drop, a whisper. Faint, almost too quiet to hear, but it was there, and it was saying my son's name. I felt my whole body tense, my breath caught in my throat. The whisper had been soft, almost swallowed by the rustling of the corn, but I heard it. Something had whispered Kaio's name. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I spun in every direction, trying to find the source. Kaio? My voice cracked as I called out, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. Silence, just the wind, the endless rustling of the stalks around me. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. My skin prickled with the undeniable feeling that I was not alone. Then, from somewhere deeper in the field, laughter, not normal laughter. It was soft, breathy, almost playful but wrong. The sound of it made my stomach churn, like it didn't belong to a child or even to a person. It was too controlled, too deliberate. My blood turned to ice. I don't remember turning around. I don't remember running. All I know is that I bolted out of that field like my life depended on it, the cornstalks slapping against my arms as I pushed through. When I finally broke free and stumbled onto the dirt path leading back to my house, I collapsed to my knees, gasping for air. I turned back, expecting to see someone standing there, watching me. But there was nothing, just the endless swaying corn. As if nothing had happened, I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that whisper again, Kaio, echoing in my mind like a taunt. And the laughter, it wasn't normal. It wasn't human. I kept telling myself it was my imagination, that I was exhausted, that grief was messing with my head. But deep down, I knew that was a lie. Something was in that cornfield. Something that knew my son's name. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone ringing. My heart leapt as I scrambled to grab it, hoping, praying that it would be news about Kyo. But when I answered, there was no voice on the other end, just breathing. Slow, deep, deliberate breathing. My stomach clenched as I gripped the phone tighter. "Who is this?" I demanded, my voice shaking. No response. Just that breathing, steady and unhurried, like whoever was on the other end wasn't in a rush to say anything, or like they wanted me to know they were there. I hung up, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. A part of me wanted to believe it was a prank, some sick joke from a stranger who had heard about Kaio's disappearance. But the rational part of my brain knew better. That whisper in the field, the laughter, and now this, it wasn't random. It was all connected. I sat there, gripping the phone, my pulse pounding in my ears. A cold, creeping realization settled over me. Whoever called knew me. They knew my fear. They were toying with me. I checked the call log. No number, just unknown caller. My fingers hovered over the redial button, but I stopped myself. What was I expecting? That they'd pick up and just explain everything? That I'd hear my son's voice on the other end? My stomach twisted at the thought. If this was connected to Kaio's disappearance, it meant someone or something was watching me. I barely had time to process that before I noticed something even worse. When I turned back toward my bedroom, I froze. My bed, something was on it. I took slow, hesitant steps forward, dread curling around my chest like a vice. And then I saw what it was, clothes, neatly folded, small, familiar. My breath hitched. It was what Kaio had been wearing the day he disappeared. The blue t-shirt with a dinosaur print. His little jeans, his socks, even his shoes, perfectly placed at the foot of the bed. My legs nearly gave out beneath me. These were the same clothes he had left the house in that day. The same ones he was wearing when he vanished. And yet they were clean. No dirt, no stains, no signs that they had been out in the elements for days. It was as if someone had washed them, pressed them, and deliberately placed them here for me to find. I couldn't move. My whole body felt frozen, like my mind refused to process what I was seeing. This wasn't just strange, it was impossible. How had Kaio's clothes ended up here? Who had cleaned them? Who had put them on my bed? My stomach twisted, and for a moment, I thought I was going to be sick. This wasn't just someone playing a cruel joke. This was personal. Whoever did this had been inside my house. I spun around, scanning the room, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway. But I was alone. The air was heavy, thick with something I couldn't name, something that made my skin crawl. I didn't even realize I was holding my breath until I let it out in a shaky exhale. I forced myself to step closer, reaching out with a trembling hand to touch the clothes. They were warm, as if someone had just folded them. That was the last straw. I staggered backward, grabbing my phone and dialing 911 with shaking fingers. The dispatcher answered, but I could barely get the words out. "My son is missing." "Someone was in my house," I gasped. "They left his clothes on my bed." "Please, you have to send someone." The call cut off, not like a dropped signal, not like interference. It was silent, completely, unnaturally silent. And then, just as I was about to try again, my phone lit up. Unknown caller. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I just stared at the screen, my hands trembling so badly I nearly dropped the phone. The ringing stopped. A few seconds passed. Then, a new notification appeared. One new voicemail. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely tap the screen. I hesitated, staring at the notification. One new voicemail. I didn't want to hear it. Every part of me was screaming to delete it, to pretend none of this was happening. But I couldn't. My thumb hovered over the play button, and before I could change my mind, I pressed it. At first, there was nothing. Just silence. Then the breathing, slow, deep, deliberate, the same breathing I had heard on the phone before. My stomach knotted so tightly it hurt. I clutched the phone, barely able to breathe myself, and then the whisper, "Mom." My heart nearly stopped. The voice was Kaio's, but it wasn't right. It was too slow, too stretched out, like someone was mimicking him, forcing his voice through something unnatural. The way he said it, "Mom," it didn't sound like a cry for help. It sounded like a greeting. I dropped the phone. It clattered to the floor, the voicemail still playing. The breathing continued, steady and unhurried. Then, a faint shuffling sound like footsteps, like movement just beyond the speaker, and then laughter. Soft, breathy, the same unnatural sound I had heard in the cornfield. My skin crawled. I kicked the phone away, as if that would make it stop. The voicemail ended abruptly. Silence filled the room again, but I didn't feel alone. I felt like something was here, watching, waiting. My eyes darted around the house. The doors were locked. The windows were shut. But someone had been here. Someone had left Kaio's clothes. Someone had whispered his name in the field. And now that thing had his voice. I couldn't stay in that house. Not after that. I grabbed my keys, my phone, and ran outside, barely remembering to lock the door behind me. The morning air was cold, but I was burning up, my heart racing like I had just woken up from a nightmare, except I wasn't waking up. This was real. Something had Kaio's voice, and it wanted me to know. I drove straight to the police station, not caring how crazy I looked. I burst through the doors, demanding to speak to someone, anyone who would listen. The officer at the front desk barely looked up. "Ma'am, like we told you before, there's no evidence of foul play in your son's disappearance. No." My voice was hoarse, shaking. "You don't understand. Someone was in my house. They left his clothes on my bed. They called me. My voice caught in my throat. How could I even explain this? They used his voice. They whispered my name. They laughed." The officer sighed, rubbing his temples like I was just another nuisance. "We'll send someone to check the house," he said, but I could hear it in his tone. They didn't believe me. They thought I was a grieving mother losing her mind. Maybe I was. But that didn't change what was happening. I left the station feeling worse than when I arrived. The police weren't going to help. They had already decided Kaio had run away, and nothing I said would change their minds. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel, trying to think. There had to be someone who would listen, someone who knew more about this place. And then it hit me, the old man who owned the farm next to the cornfield. I didn't waste any time. I drove straight to the old farm, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles were white. I didn't know much about the owner, just that his name was Mr. Almeida, and he had lived there longer than anyone else in town. If there was something strange about that cornfield, if there were stories people didn't talk about, he would know. His house sat at the edge of his property, an old wooden structure with chipped paint and a sagging porch. I parked and hesitated for a second, my gut twisting with nerves. What if he thought I was crazy too? What if he slammed the door in my face like the police had? I pushed the thought away and knocked. It took a while, but eventually I heard slow footsteps inside. The door creaked open just a few inches, and a single eye peered out at me, clouded, tired, but sharp. "What do you want?" His voice was rough, like he hadn't spoken to anyone in a long time. "My son is missing," I said quickly, before he could shut the door. "He disappeared near the cornfield." I hesitated, then added, "And something's been happening. Things I can't explain." His expression didn't change, but he stilled, like he already knew what I was talking about. "Please," I whispered, "I just need to know if you've seen anything. If you've heard anything." For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, finally, he sighed and unlatched the door. "You'd better come in." I stepped inside, and the first thing I noticed was the smell of old wood, dust, and something else, something damp and earthy. The house was cluttered but not messy, filled with old furniture and stacks of newspapers. Mr. Almeida shuffled to a chair near the window and gestured for me to sit. I stayed standing. "You're not the first," he said finally, his voice low and tired. A chill ran through me. "The first what?" He sighed, rubbing his hands together like he was debating whether to continue. "The first mother to come knocking on my door. The first to lose a child to that field." The air left my lungs. "What are you talking about?" He glanced at me, and for the first time, I saw something in his expression that terrified me more than anything else: resignation. Like he had already accepted something that I couldn't. "That cornfield," he exhaled sharply. "It's not just land, it's old. Older than this town, older than any of us. People go missing. Sometimes they come back, but not the same. And sometimes—" "You only get pieces." My stomach lurched. "Pieces?" He nodded toward the door. "Like the clothes they left for you." I staggered back a step. "How do you know about that?" His expression darkened. "Because that's how it starts." I didn't want to hear more. I didn't want to believe it, but I had no choice. I told him everything: the whispering, the laughter, the phone calls, the voicemail. He listened without interrupting, his face unreadable. When I finished, he just nodded, like it was exactly what he had expected. "They're playing with you," he murmured. "Who?" I demanded. He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Not who, what?" A wave of nausea rolled through me. "You're saying something." "Took my son?" His jaw tightened. "Took or kept. And if they're still mimicking him, still calling to you, it means he's still there." Hope and horror collided inside me. Then I can get him back? Mr. Almeida didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood up, walked to a dusty old cabinet, and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. He handed it to me, and when I unwrapped it, my breath caught in my throat, a rusted machete. "If you go back in there," he said, "you don't go unarmed." That night I stood at the edge of the cornfield, the machete clutched in my hand, my flashlight beam trembling. My heart hammered in my chest. The air was still, unnaturally so. It was waiting for me. I took a deep breath and stepped forward. The corn swallowed me instantly, the stalks too close, pressing against me like they were alive. My breathing was shallow. I forced myself forward, whispering Kayo's name under my breath. "I'm coming, baby," I choked out. "Mom's coming." Then a rustling ahead. I stopped, gripping the machete tighter. The flashlight flickered, and in that moment, I saw it. Kayo, or something that looked like him. He stood just a few feet away, barefoot, wearing the same clothes he had vanished in, even though those clothes were folded neatly back in my house. His face was pale, his eyes too wide, too dark. "Mom?" he whispered, but his lips didn't move. The voice came from somewhere else, surrounding me, echoing from the corn itself. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. Then he smiled, too wide, too wrong. And behind him, the corn began to open. I don't remember running. I don't remember screaming. All I remember is bursting out of the cornfield, collapsing onto the dirt, my hands bleeding from where I had clenched the machete too hard. Behind me, the corn swayed, but nothing followed. Kayo was gone, and the whispers, they never stopped. Even now, when I pass that field, when the wind blows just right, I hear it. "Mom,